are back, and we are joined now by Jake Bittle, staff writer at Grist and author of The Great Displacement, Climate Change and the Next American Migration. Jake, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So your book really does center around people's firsthand stories here in the US, in terms of displacement from climate change. Hundreds of thousands of people in the United States displaced from their homes every year due to the effects of climate change. Like, how did you come upon that structure? Did you go into writing your book with that intention, both making it more of like a personal focus on people's experience and also making it US based?
Yeah, so I thought that it would be useful to what I wanted to do at the start was just to try to document what the present tense, effects of climate change in the US were, because I thought that, people tend to conceive of it as a problem that will either happen, in the future, the distant future, or, somewhere else, like sort of very, very far distance across the globe. And especially with the, phenomenon of housing displacement or migration, I think people tend to think of it as something that is just not really like a US problem. And so what I was just trying to do is show, okay, after these climate disasters that, sort of appear and disappear from the news cycle relatively quickly, like what are the long-term effects on the communities where these disasters happen, and what ends up happening to people who get, temporarily displaced from their homes, how many of them make it back, and how many sort of end up moving somewhere else, whether voluntarily or involuntarily.
I really also liked how your title is a reference to the Great Migration, the 20th century migration of Black Americans to from the South to other cities around the country. And it, what that part obviously must have been intentional as well, right? Because your book does do a great job of focusing on the racial politics of climate displacement in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of trying to draw both, there's both a similarity and a distinction, right? And one is that, the similarity is that, like the Great Migration, climate migration in the United States, it cleaves people along lines of race and class very distinctly. But there's also a dissimilarity, right? Where the Great Migration was a relatively sort of one directional movement of people from a very specific region of the country to a very specific other region. There was both a push factor and also a pull factor of, wages, the promise of better treatment in northern cities. And in the case of climate displacement, it's much more chaotic, right? Like, sort of happens everywhere in different parts of every region. And there's by no means like a single destination or coordinated direction of this movement. And so in the book, I kind of liken it to like when a pot is kind of like churning as it reaches a boiling point. It's more like there's a kind of chronic, generalized instability in certain places that over time leads people to fly off in all different directions. So there's both a really distinct similarity, and that's like the racial and class divisions. And then there's a dissimilarity, which is like, it's just not by any means so coordinated or recognizably directional as the Great Migration was.
Have you considered what Ben Shapiro posed years ago, that people who are experiencing flooding should just sell their homes and then that kind of solves everything?
It's a very funny video that I watched several times while writing the book, and it's very interesting because like there's an element of that that's actually currently baked into the actual functioning of the housing market in coastal places, right? Which is like, when people do buy a home in a risky area, they sort of have the assumption that they are going to be able to sell it to someone else, not Aquaman, as the video says, but
Yeah.
somebody else will go. And in part, it's because there's just not enough information in the market about what the potential risks are, and we don't exactly know what the timeline is. So sea level rise, it's very difficult to predict. So when I start a 30-year mortgage in, Miami, I don't really know how many 30-year mortgages there are left before the home is underwater. So yeah, I mean, there's a kind of like, I think I wanted to liken in the book to like when Wile E. Coyote like runs off the cliff and he doesn't notice that he's running on air until he looks down, but then as soon
Mm-hmm.
as he looks down, he starts falling. So like that Ben Shapiro's mistake is actually kind of like really, really insightful in a reverse way, because it's actually the way that the market works right now. And at some point that will change.
Yeah, I mean, you particularly focus on it, I would say, or maybe uh, one of the more relevant parts to this particular talking point is your Santa Rosa example, where there was this massive housing shortage after wildfires. It's different than flooding, but it is an example of housing being at the forefront of this. And like my aunt lives in Santa Rosa. I have heard a lot about what that experience has been like. It, through my family, like what facing those wildfires and how that created such insecurity there. But of course, for people on the front lines, it's devastating. Talk a bit about that chapter in your book,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
wildfires affected the housing market there.
Right. Yeah, I think this is like it's a really, really important example because there was a really, really dire existing problem in that area before the wildfire, which is that there's just this extreme shortage of housing. It had one of the lowest vacancy rates in the country, and we could go into all the reasons why that's true in Northern California and California generally. But that wasn't caused by climate change, obviously. But then you have a city where there's already really no vacant rental housing. And then suddenly 4,000 or 5,000 homes get wiped off the map. And those are, not only apartments, but also relatively large homes that were owned by relatively wealthy people. And so it took this existing problem and made it like, it sort of supercharged it, right? Where you have these wealthy people who lost their homes and they're looking for a place to go. So maybe they have a second home and they suddenly say, okay, well, we're going to, kick our renter out of our second home and live there, or we're going to go to our vacation home. And there's this downward pressure that happened where renters and people who had the least equity in their homes already, they ended up basically getting pushed out of the market because there was no longer space for people at the top. And so everyone got crowded down. And so I spoke to several people who, they rented one apartment for every 6 months for years, and they paid, 3 times what they'd paid before the fire. I spoke to people who just gave up on California. They ended up moving to places like Kentucky where they had family. So yeah, it's just like created this sort of insane chaos for years. And the prices have never really stabilized because it takes so long to rebuild that supply. And in the meantime, more people show up, sort of undeterred by the fire. And so it's just like it's a mess, right? And that's the sense I was trying to capture in that chapter of just like those first few months and that first year after the fire, people were paying, 10 grand a month just to get a place to live. And there was just this like chaos and trauma of living through that market, almost more traumatic than the experience of fleeing the fire itself for many people.
The shock of having to essentially run through your savings
Yes.
just in a second to get
Exactly.
housing after a climate disaster.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, these states like California, New York, that have kind of blue legislatures need to get to the forefront of creating some sort of fund for people not even relocate them, but get some subsidy for finding housing during that period, because like you speak about as well in the book, the rising insurance premiums in a lot of these areas of the country. I mean, this is just going to become a huge problem as more climate displacement happens. Insurance not being able, people being priced out of insuring their homes in this way. Can you talk about that dynamic?
Yeah, this has also been an issue in California and Florida, especially, where basically the insurance companies, they have difficulty. They're answerable to shareholders, so they have to turn a profit, and they kind of can't turn a profit, or they say they can't, at least in California and Florida, because the amount they have to pay out in damages and claims and what's called reinsurance is more than they take in from the premiums, right? So basically, they say, well, if we can't raise prices to really, really high levels, we're just going to kind of have to get out of certain areas, these like mountainous areas of California, for instance, where it's just like too risky, they say, to insure. And so the state, like California legislature and the insurance office there, they've tried really hard to tamp down this sort of like runaway problem in the insurance market. But it's really, really difficult to find out a way to bring the companies to heel without driving them out of the state altogether, right? Because they could also say, we don't want to write here, period, right? Let alone just like in those specific areas. But I think like in general, in all the places where this happens with different perils, fire, hurricanes, windstorm damage, what you kind of see is that there's the kind of, it really, really raises the threshold for who can afford home ownership, as opposed to renting, right? So
Yes, which is
there's this
already
like,
insanely high
right,
given
right.
the quality of life for the generation that isn't the
Yeah,
baby boomers.
exactly. Like, I think people who are my age will say, well, couldn't afford a house anyway before climate
Yeah.
change. But like, there's this serious thing where like we think in the United States of like the middle class, upwardly mobile homeowner as somebody who saves up and they put equity in a home. It's an investment, and they're supposed to be able to keep up with it and then use that to like ascend the income ladder. And that, because of housing supply shortages, and then because of insurance especially, it's kind of become like an illusion for a lot of people in the riskiest areas, right? Where the cost of insurance is just so much that it's impossible to keep up with most mortgages, even in relatively affordable areas. That's like a serious like spiritual problem for the country, as well as a policy problem, where it's like this sort of much touted class of people, the middle class, it's sort of being eroded by the cost of climate change.
Yeah. Juniper J, one of our IMers, writes in and said, also consider that in Florida, homeowners cannot get home insurance. DeSantis called for a special session to address this, but passed fascist legislation instead. I wasn't aware of that homeowner insurance element. Is that something
Yeah.
you're up on?
Yeah, so years ago, like about 3 decades ago, after a hurricane in 1992, the insurance market basically in Florida basically collapsed, and it was like, I mean, this is like a controversial way to put it. It was basically partially socialized. Like, there's a public option for insurance, for windstorm insurance in Florida, and there's all these small private companies that still offer, but they have sort of started to flee in recent years as the cost of hurricanes has gone up. And like Juniper's right, there's a lot of people who can't get insurance except for through this public option, which is really expensive. It's not very good coverage, and everybody's going to it. So it's like this enormous burden on like the public purse. And I think the big question for the like very, very, very conservative Florida legislature is how do you manage this system where basically the taxpayers are now footing the bill for, there's basically a public subsidy for insurance in risky places. And can they like turn it back into a normal market, a functioning sort of the free market that a conservative want? I kind of think the answer is no. But in either case, right, like it's like you basically transferring the risk of people who live in really, really risky areas, not often through fault of their own, but you're transferring that to everybody, even people who don't own homes, right? So
Mm.
basically, like, you're taking a person who maybe owns a car in Orlando but rents an apartment, and their tax burden is in part the burden of like a person who owns a mansion in Miami Beach. So that's like a very, very difficult situation that I don't know that the legislature is quite equipped to address. They don't seem super interested in like a comprehensive solution at this point.
Doesn't seem to be the case. But I guess let's talk a bit more about Florida because that's your first chapter,
Yes,
right?
that's where I'm from.
Oh, there
Yes,
you go. Whereabouts?
Tampa, about an hour north of Tampa.
Tampa. There you go. So uh, the you start in Florida, telling the story of a guy named Patrick Garvey. What this was I guess one of the three chapters in the start of your book where you're focusing on these human stories behind the weather disasters. What's Patrick Garvey's story?
Yeah, he came from Canada down to Florida, sort of just like looking for meaning, and he spent about 5 years rehabilitating this tropical fruit grove that had kind of gone to seed. It was the property of this old hermit, and it became like this public sort of community resource on this island called Big Pine Key, which is like one of the last kind of like working class enclaves in the Florida Keys archipelago. And then this hurricane called Irma, just an astonishingly powerful hurricane. Just all but he had basically spent almost a decade restoring this grove, and right as he finished, basically the hurricane destroyed it. Also, kind of destroyed his life. His marriage fell apart. His kids went with their mother to Brazil, and he basically spent like 5 years, kind of in like a dark night of the soul, trying to restore this grove, only to kind of find that long term there's this other vulnerability that the island faces from sea level rise. So as the seas get higher, even independent of a storm, water will creep underneath, salt water will creep underneath the island, potentially making it very difficult to grow tropical fruit. So I was kind of using it to show that there's like these two scales of vulnerability that people face in climate change. And the Keys is like a great example, where on the one hand, you have these giant kind of percussive disasters that completely destroy housing stock and render people without their homes. And then you have these slower moving disasters like sea level rise or drought, where people's sort of their ability to engage with the land and their ability to work, their ability to live sort of erodes over time. And the worst affected places are dealing with both of those at the same time. And in the case of the Keys, like the risk is really existential from both, that you might not really be able to, the place might not really be able to survive on a century-long time scale because there's just so much risk.
That's insane to think about. But I mean, obviously it makes total sense. Another place that you highlight that has is in a very vulnerable position is this indigenous community in Louisiana. Obviously, Louisiana vulnerable in a variety of different ways. We know this from Katrina and more. Talk a bit about that if you don't mind, Jake.
Yeah, so this is I was trying to kind of look at the effects of sea level rise and coastal erosion on, coastal communities that aren't like big developed cities like Miami. So I went to this area about an hour and a half south of New Orleans. This is a long, very, very long standing indigenous community, mostly made up of like inshore shrimp fishermen. And for a long time, it was extremely self-sufficient. Like they could raise cattle, they could grow their own crops, they could obviously get shrimp and get pelts from nutria to sell for fur. And then as the coast eroded, it just became impossible to sustain this kind of community, right? Like the ground was too wet for the cattle to walk on, it's too salty to grow the crops. And the independence of the community kind of fell apart. And the only available work, besides offshore shrimp fishermen, is working for the oil industry. And there's a kind of like deep resonance here that I thought was really important to highlight, where, there's both man-made climate change, which is like these global phenomena that are changing the way that weather works and water works. And that's happening there. But there's also this just sort of like straightforward human-caused environmental degradation that you can see right in front of your eyes. And so in the case of Louisiana, it was the oil industry that they basically sliced up the whole marshland so that they could build canals to get, benzene and oil in and out of the Gulf. And this was like there was a twofold problem where the oil industry, they destroyed the marsh, and then the global warming caused by the oil industry then further caused the seas to rise. So it's just sort of this nexus of a lot of the causes of climate change and just the way that we relate to land. And you had a community that had a deeply productive and sustainable relationship to this marshland environment that's basically been evicted over a century, by the actions of big oil.
Well, it really is, big oil creeping in. It's almost kind of shock doctrine on a micro scale where they're able to exploit the macro conditions created by climate change, which they contribute to, and then on the ground, they creep in on like indigenous self-sustaining communities for their own profit. That's a really good encapsulation of what we're dealing with, I would say. I also wanted to talk a bit about this North Carolina historically black city that was built on flood-prone land that you talk about in your book.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the fact that that city was even built also is one of the long-term kind of structural climate exposure issues for non-white, non-wealthy communities in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, the town Lincoln City was built on land that essentially nobody else really wanted it, right? And this is true in a lot of other places in North Carolina, like where formerly enslaved populations they bought land that was too flood prone to use for agriculture, or that was how the white planters viewed it, right? And so this was a really like important one though, because a lot of times when you talk about the solutions to this kind of climate vulnerability, what people say is like, well, we can, give people money to move elsewhere or relocate them. And that's like one of the best tools that we have to fix this problem, right? If you get people out of the way, then they can't be hit by the hurricane anymore, right? And so that makes sense in theory, but this was like the first time that the U.S. government really tried this was in 2000 after these two hurricanes hit this Black community. And basically they came in and said, well, we'll give you guys money if you leave and move somewhere else in the city. And, there was really no other option as the government saw it. But for the people in the community, they saw this as a really, really deeply traumatic event, right? Where they wanted to stay. They wanted to rebuild, and they were really attached to this land. It was the only place that most of their families had ever been able to own property or had ever lived in the postbellum era. And the government really didn't give them much of a choice. They said, well, we'll give you the money and you leave, right? And so this is called managed retreat. It's like a climate adaptation policy. But here it was a really, really, really tragic event, and it destroyed this really thriving community, which was very vulnerable. And a lot of the people, once they left and took the money, they really didn't fare so well. Their homes went into foreclosure because they couldn't keep up with the more expensive mortgage, or they lost track of their, community that they had once had, right? So I think it's like a cautionary tale for how to solve the problem of yes, you can move people, but there's a really, really, really deep intangible thing that people have with their communities and with the places that they live. And we have to respect that and find a way to honor that, even as we try to help people move out of the worst affected areas.
Right. I mean, in terms of that kind of mitigation for displacement, what do you see as some of the more viable paths forward, that included, as long as it's structured in a way that
Yeah.
has puts vulnerable communities in mind, doesn't reverberate some of the already systemic issues? What are some of the best solutions you think?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, there's basically two options, right? You can do that. You can pay people to leave and try to help them relocate through sort of long-term stipends, maybe relocation assistance. Maybe, as is the case in a few places, they've tried this after the recession, where maybe places that are less vulnerable, give people money to move there. I think Detroit tried it. Oklahoma City maybe tried it for non-climate reasons. And then there's a second option, which is you try to make the place less vulnerable that people already are, right? So, all over the Gulf Coast, there's homes that are elevated 12 or 13 feet off the ground. That tends to help with storm surge. There's all kinds of things you can do with what are called living shorelines, or create, parks or berms along the water to help with the risk of flooding. And then, you can retrofit homes themselves. So after Hurricane Andrew in 1992, Florida mandated a really, really strong home construction standard that makes homes pretty resilient to hurricanes. You can do the same thing with wildfire. So you really have to decide between armoring, so-called, or sort of resilience, as it's often referred to, or relocation. And that's a really, really difficult choice for communities to make. And I think the answer oftentimes is it's a little bit of both, where there's some areas where it's just so expensive and just it's impossible to find a way to protect. So you have to help those people move. And then there's some places for example, downtown Manhattan, for instance, where it's very, very, very valuable, and it's worth almost an unlimited amount of money to pay to protect, right? So you could build berms around downtown Manhattan, or, the Army Corps of Engineers wants to create these storm gates that you could use to control flooding. So there's all kinds of things you can do. And the Biden administration has started to spend a relatively small, but historically, relative to history, relatively large amount of money on pursuing some of them. But we're still kind of in kindergarten on it. We don't really know what works, what doesn't. And I think there's a certain amount of experimentation that has to be done with both resilience and managed retreat before we're going to know what are the best practices in this regard, because we've really never tried it very much.
Yeah, we're playing with fire, no pun intended, but obviously there's going to need to be a robust ramp up in the coming years, since we're not meeting any of our targets, and the effects are definitely being felt acutely right now. Jake Bittle, staff writer at Grist, author of The Great Displacement, Climate Change and the Next American Migration. We'll put a link to your book in the description, podcast, YouTube description, wherever you're watching this or listening, and at majority.fm. Or what's our website? It's majority.fm. I don't even know. Thanks so much, Jake. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks.